There are mornings when your eyes open before the sun rises, and already your heart is racing with all that waits. The lists, the expectations, the voices that whisper you're falling behind. My dear sister, I see you there, standing in your kitchen at dawn, shoulders bent with invisible weights, wondering when it all became too much. When did your hands, those beautiful, capable hands, begin to tremble under the weight of everything you believe you must carry? Some days, the guilt of what remains undone feels heavier than what you've actually accomplished. Isn't that the strangest thing? How we can move mountains and still apologize for the pebble left unturned. I've lived many seasons, watched the trees bend and straighten again, and I want to tell you something. I wish someone had whispered to me when I was drowning in the waters of not enough. When I was younger, I believed strength meant carrying everything without complaint. Every expectation, every need, every silent cry for help, I gathered them all into my arms like precious children, never stopping to ask if my back could bear the load. Perhaps you've done the same. This world has a way of teaching women that our value lies in how much we can endure without breaking. How efficiently we can manage households, careers, relationships, all while maintaining that serene smile that says, yes, I can handle one more thing, one more responsibility, one more person who needs something only you can give. And so we carry. We carry until our fingertips grow numb. We carry until our breath comes shallow. We carry until we forget what it feels like to walk unburdened. I remember a Tuesday afternoon, years ago, when I stood in a grocery store, staring at shelves of cereal as tears silently rolled down my face. Not because anything terrible had happened, simply because I couldn't decide which box to buy, and somehow that small decision felt like it might break me, because it wasn't just about cereal, it was about the 40 other decisions waiting for me. The people depending on my strength, the impossible standards I'd set for myself. That afternoon, an elderly woman touched my elbow and said something I've never forgotten. Whatever it is, honey, put it down for a minute. The world won't stop turning if you rest those shoulders. I didn't understand then what she meant. How could I put down what felt sewn into my skin? The responsibility, the expectations, the belief that if I wasn't doing everything, I wasn't doing enough. But she saw what I couldn't, that I was disappearing beneath the weight. You see, this guilt we feel when we can't manage everything, it's not a moral failing. It's not weakness. It's the natural response of a heart that has been told its worth depends on its productivity. When did we begin to measure our days, not by moments of connection or peace, but by tasks completed? When did we start believing that our value as women, as human beings, was tied to how efficiently we could cross items off a never-ending list? I want to tell you what took me decades to learn. The most sacred thing you can do with a burden too heavy is to set it down, not abandon it, not ignore it. Simply acknowledge that perhaps it was never meant to be carried by one person alone. The guilt doesn't disappear overnight. It whispers still in quiet moments. You should be doing more. They need you. Don't rest yet. These voices have ancient roots, passed down through generations of women who were taught that self-sacrifice was the highest form of love. But what if true love for others and ourselves begins when we honor our limits? When we recognize that we are vessels meant to be both filled and emptied, not bottomless wells from which others can endlessly draw. Tonight, as you lay your head down, feeling the weight of what remains undone, I want you to place your hand over your heart and feel its steady rhythm. That heartbeat doesn't quicken or slow based on your productivity. It continues its faithful work. Whether you've checked everything off your list or nothing at all, you are not the sum of what you accomplish. You are not valuable only when useful. You are precious in your very being, a miracle of breath and bone and spirit that no amount of doing could ever enhance. The weight we carry, Perhaps it's time we examined it together, piece by piece, not to abandon our responsibilities, but to question whether each one truly belongs in our arms. There's a particular silence that falls in the space between what we've done and what remains undone. In that gap, can you hear them? Those whispers of inadequacy that seem to rise from nowhere and everywhere at once. You should have finished that by now. A better mother would have remembered. Everyone else seems to manage just fine. These voices so familiar they almost sound like our own. They've been with some of us for so long that we've forgotten they aren't actually the truth. They're echoes, my dear sister. Echoes of expectations that were planted in our hearts long before we had the wisdom to question them. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, papers scattered around me like fallen leaves, deadlines looming like storm clouds. My son needed help with his homework. The phone was ringing. Dinner wasn't started, and inside my chest, a hurricane of anxiety was building with each passing minute. I can't do this, I whispered to the empty room. I simply cannot do all of this. And the shame that followed that admission felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, as if acknowledging my limits was somehow a betrayal of everyone who depended on me. Do you know that feeling? That moment when you realize you are, after all, gloriously and terribly human? We live in a world that celebrates the myth of the woman who does it all. We see her in magazines, on television, in our social media feeds, this mythical creature who raises perfect children, excels in her career, maintains a spotless home, nurtures a passionate marriage, preserves her health and beauty, and still has time for self-care and friendships. What a beautiful, impossible creation she is. And how many tears have been shed in the shadow of her perfection. The truth, the messy, liberating truth, is that no one, not a single soul walking this earth, is handling everything perfectly. Behind closed doors, even those who seem to have it all together are dropping balls, forgetting appointments, serving cereal for dinner, and crying in bathroom stalls. The difference isn't in who manages everything and who doesn't. The difference is in who has made peace with their humanity and who is still fighting against it. Those whispers of inadequacy gain their power from secrecy and isolation. When we believe we're the only ones struggling, they grow louder, more convincing. They tell us that our inability to do everything is unique to us, a personal failing rather than the universal condition of being alive in bodies and days that have limits. I learned to quiet those whispers, not by becoming more capable, but by becoming more honest, by looking into the eyes of another woman and saying, I'm drowning a little today, and seeing in her gaze not judgment but recognition, not pity but solidarity. There is such power in speaking our truth, in admitting when we're overwhelmed, in asking for help not as a last resort, but as an act of wisdom. The most courageous women I've known aren't those who never struggle, but those who struggle openly, who have the strength to say, this is too much for me right now, without following it with 1,000 apologies. What would change in your life, my sister, if you allowed yourself to be gloriously imperfect, if you spoke to yourself with the same compassion you offer so readily to others? Those whispers of inadequacy, they don't disappear overnight, but they do lose their grip when exposed to the light of shared experience. When we realize that the struggle to balance all the pieces of our complex lives isn't a personal failure, but a shared human journey. Tonight, when those voices rise again, I want you to imagine my hand in yours. Imagine women across time and space who have stood where you stand, feeling what you feel. None of us have it all figured out. All of us are learning as we go. And that, my dear, is not inadequacy. That is the beautiful, broken, magnificent journey of a life fully lived. There was a time when I believed I could be everything to everyone. The perfect mother, the devoted daughter, the tireless worker, the supportive friend. I crafted this pedestal with my own hands. You see, built it from expectations and shoulds, from comparisons and desperate love. I stood atop it, smiling, even as I felt the foundation shift beneath my feet. Perhaps you know this pedestal too. Perhaps you've spent years trying to balance upon it, terrified of the fall, exhausted by the effort of maintaining the illusion of perfection. My dear sister, I want to tell you about the day my pedestal finally crumbled. It wasn't some grand, dramatic moment. There were no witnesses to my undoing. Just an ordinary Tuesday when I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor, surrounded by spilled groceries, sobbing uncontrollably because I had forgotten to mail an important bill. My child needed new shoes, and I had missed a deadline at work. In that moment, everything I had been holding together simply came apart. And in the silence that followed my tears, I waited for the catastrophe. I waited for the world to punish me for my failure, for everyone I loved to turn away in disappointment. But do you know what happened instead? My teenage son came home, saw me there on the floor, and without a word, sat down beside me. He picked up an orange that had rolled under the table and simply held my hand until my breathing steadied. The world didn't end because I crumbled. The people who truly loved me didn't love me less. That's the secret they don't tell you about pedestals. They're not built to honor us. They're built to isolate us, to keep us striving, exhausted, forever reaching for an impossible standard of womanhood that no human being could ever maintain. We place ourselves on these pedestals or allow others to place us there, believing that our worth depends on our ability to be exceptional in every area of life simultaneously. We internalize the message that ordinary humanity, with its limitations and needs, is somehow a betrayal of what others deserve from us. But what if the most powerful thing we could do is to deliberately step down? Not to fall in defeat, but to choose solid ground instead of precarious height. There is such freedom in acknowledging that we were never meant to be superhuman, that needing rest doesn't make us weak, that asking for help doesn't make us inadequate, that saying no doesn't make us selfish. I remember the first time I told a friend I couldn't help with a project because I was simply too exhausted. The words felt like pebbles in my mouth, hard and uncomfortable. I waited for her disappointment, her judgment. Instead, she said, "Thank you for taking care of yourself. That's what I need to learn to do." My vulnerability became permission for hers. That's what happens when we dare to step down from our pedestals. We don't diminish ourselves, we expand the possibility of authentic connection. We create space for others to be human alongside us. The guilt that comes with not being able to do it all, it's tied to this crumbling pedestal, to the belief that we should somehow transcend the basic limitations of being human, having finite energy, finite time, finite capacity for giving. But what if that guilt isn't trying to punish us? What if it's actually trying to guide us back to a more sustainable way of being, back to ground level, where we can look others in the eye as equals, not as superhuman saviors or servants? The day my pedestal crumbled was the day I began to truly live in my own skin, to acknowledge my needs without shame, to understand that my worth wasn't tied to my productivity or perfection. My sister, whatever pedestal you're trying to balance on today, whether built by society, family expectations, or your own impossible standards, know this: the fall you fear has the potential to become your greatest liberation. And when you find yourself on solid ground, you may discover something surprising. Those who truly love you never needed your perfection. They only ever wanted your presence. Have you ever noticed how shallow your breathing becomes when you're racing against time? How the air seems to stop at your collarbones, never quite reaching the bottom of your lungs, as if your body is conserving every resource for the marathon of expectations stretching before you. I've spent many years of my life breathing this way, half breaths, survival breaths, the kind that keep you moving but never quite nourish the deepest parts of you. This is what expectations do to our bodies when they become too numerous, too heavy. They literally change how we breathe. I remember watching my grandmother hang clothes on the line when I was a child. Even as her fingers worked quickly, pinning each garment with practiced efficiency, her breath remained deep and steady. She moved with purpose, but without panic. I asked her once how she managed to do so much without becoming frantic like my mother often did. She looked at me with those wise eyes and said, "I know what's mine to carry and what isn't. And at the end of the day, the sun will set whether the work is done or not." It took me decades to understand the profound wisdom in her words, to recognize that expectations, whether from others or ourselves, are not mandates from the universe. They are invitations that we can accept, negotiate, or sometimes lovingly decline. The expectations we place on ourselves as women are often inherited, aren't they? Passed down through generations like fine china or family recipes. We absorb them without question. A good mother never loses patience. A successful woman manages career and home with equal brilliance. A worthy wife anticipates needs before they're spoken. Each expectation becomes a thread in the complex tapestry of our guilt. Each unmet standard becomes evidence of our supposed inadequacy. But what if we could examine these expectations one by one? Hold each up to the light and ask, is this truly mine to carry? Does this bring life or does it deplete it? Does this serve love or fear? I began this practice in my 40s, though I wish I'd started sooner. I would sit quietly with a cup of tea and write down the expectations that were causing me the most distress. Then beside each one, I'd write whose voice I heard when I thought of it. Sometimes it was my mother's voice, sometimes society's. Often, it was my own voice, harsher and more demanding than I would ever be with someone I loved. This simple act of awareness began to create space between me and these expectations. Not so that I could abandon all responsibility, but so I could choose consciously which expectations aligned with my deepest values and which were simply habits of self-judgment. Breathing through expectations means neither fighting against them nor surrendering to them completely. It means acknowledging their presence and then deciding, with each inhale and exhale, what deserves your precious life energy. When we feel overwhelmed by all we're not accomplishing, it's often because we're trying to breathe life into too many expectations at once. We're trying to inhale the whole ocean when our lungs were designed for air. My sister, you were never meant to be everything to everyone. You were meant to be something vital to particular someone's, including yourself. The expectations that matter most are those that guide you toward love, toward wholeness, toward the unique purpose that only your heart can recognize. The most radical act of courage for many of us is to take a full breath in the midst of overwhelming expectations, to pause and ask, what is mine to carry in this moment, and what can I set down either permanently or just for today? I've watched women transform their relationship with guilt by learning to breathe differently through their expectations. Not by lowering their standards or abandoning their commitments, but by bringing consciousness to which standards and commitments truly deserve their allegiance. The next time you feel that familiar tightness in your chest, that signal that you're drowning in expectations rather than being nourished by purpose, I invite you to stop. Place one hand on your heart and one on your belly. Breathe all the way down to your roots. Feel your body remembering its wisdom. And in that moment of conscious breathing, ask yourself, what is needed most right now? Not what is expected, what is truly needed. The answer that rises from that deep, full breath will rarely steer you wrong. There's a word that makes many strong women flinch, a word that sounds like defeat to ears trained to hear only in the language of achievement and control. That word is surrender. For so long, I misunderstood it. Perhaps you have too. I thought surrender meant giving up, waving a white flag, admitting failure. I thought it meant letting down all those who depend on me. But life has taught me that true surrender is something altogether different and infinitely more powerful. True surrender is not about giving up, it's about giving over. Recognizing that some battles were never ours to fight, some burdens were never ours to carry, some outcomes were never ours to control. I learned this lesson on a sweltering summer afternoon while trying to force open a window that had been painted shut for years. My hands were raw, my frustration mounting with each failed attempt. I had decided this window would open, despite all evidence that it had other plans. A wise friend watching my struggle finally said, "Why this window? Why today? There are other ways to let air into this room." Her simple question stopped me cold. I realized I had become so fixated on this one solution, this one expression of control, that I had lost sight of what I actually needed, which was simply a cooler room, not a victory over an innocent window. How often do we do this in our lives? How often do we exhaust ourselves fighting circumstances that might be inviting us to find another path? How often do we resist the natural flow of our days because it doesn't match the picture we had in our minds? The gentle art of surrender begins with the recognition that control is largely an illusion. We plan, we strive, we organize, and still, life happens in its own mysterious way. Children get sick on the day of important presentations. Aging parents need care during our busiest seasons. Our bodies demand rest, precisely when our to-do lists are longest. These are not interruptions to our lives, they are our lives. To surrender is to stop fighting reality, to acknowledge what is actually happening, rather than exhausting ourselves by insisting on what should be happening. It is to recognize that sometimes the most productive thing we can do is to let go of our productivity. I remember a particularly difficult season of my life when everything seemed to be falling apart simultaneously. My work was demanding more than I could give. A relationship was ending painfully. My health was suffering. I kept pushing, believing that if I just tried harder, moved faster, slept less, I could regain control. Until one morning, I simply couldn't get out of bed. My body, wiser than my mind, enacted a surrender my ego couldn't accept. And in that forced stillness, something unexpected happened. Solutions began to appear not from my striving, but from the quiet space of letting go. People stepped forward, with help I hadn't allowed them to offer. Priorities clarified themselves without my frantic sorting, and I discovered that the world continued to spin even when I wasn't personally keeping it in motion. That is the paradox of surrender. What looks like weakness becomes a different kind of strength. What feels like failure becomes the beginning of a more honest success. The guilt we feel when we can't manage everything often comes from our resistance to this surrender. We believe we should be able to control outcomes, manage circumstances, fulfill every expectation, including those that were impossible from the start. But what if the inability to do it all isn't a sign of inadequacy, but an invitation to a more authentic way of being? What if those moments when we feel most overwhelmed are actually life's way of guiding us toward our true priorities? I've watched women transform when they learn this gentle art, not by doing less necessarily, but by fighting less against the natural limitations of being human. By accepting that some days, love looks like folded laundry and home-cooked meals, while other days, it looks like takeout food and presents. By understanding that efficiency is not always the highest value, and that a life well lived is not the same as a to-do list well completed. To practice surrender is to ask different questions. Not how can I do it all, but what is mine to do in this season? Not why can't I manage everything, but what is this overwhelm trying to teach me? There is profound peace in this surrender, not because our circumstances necessarily change, but because our relationship to them does. We stop trying to be the gods of our own lives and remember that we are beautifully and simply human. There's a garden I want to show you. It's not a place you can reach by foot or by car. It exists within you, a sacred space where the seeds of self-forgiveness are waiting to be planted. For many of us, this garden lies untended. We've become master gardeners in other people's lives, nurturing their growth, weeding out their doubts, watering their dreams with our encouragement. But our own inner landscape, that we often leave to chance, or worse, to the harsh elements of self-criticism. I spent years believing that forgiving myself for my limitations was somehow dangerous, as if self-compassion would lead to complacency, as if holding myself to impossible standards was the only thing keeping me from falling into complete inadequacy. Perhaps you've believed this too. The truth I've come to understand is that forgiveness is not permission to fail. It's recognition that failure is already an inevitable part of being human. Forgiveness doesn't lower our standards, it humanizes them. It creates fertile ground where growth becomes possible again. I remember a particularly difficult period when my children were young, and I was struggling to balance their needs with work that felt essential to my sense of purpose. One evening, after missing my daughter's school performance because of a work commitment, I sat on the edge of her bed, my heart heavy with guilt. "Are you mad at me?" she asked, her small voice piercing the darkness. "No, sweetheart, why would I be mad at you?" I replied, confused. "Because you look sad, and I thought maybe you were mad at yourself, and that made me think I should be mad at you too." Her words stopped my breath. In that moment, I saw how my inability to forgive myself was teaching her to be unforgiving too, not just with me, but potentially with herself. I was planting seeds I never intended to grow. That night, I began to understand that self-forgiveness isn't selfish. It's essential not just for our own well-being, but for the health of everyone connected to us. When we withhold compassion from ourselves, we unintentionally limit the compassion we can truly extend to others. The seeds of self-forgiveness are simple but powerful. They begin with acknowledgement, naming the specific ways we believe we failed without exaggeration or minimization. Just the plain truth, held in open hands. Next comes understanding not excuses, but context. What pressures were you under? What were you trying to protect or achieve? What fears were driving you? What did you not know then that you know now? And finally, there is the gentle act of release, not forgetting, but consciously choosing to stop punishing yourself for being human, for having limits, for making mistakes while trying your imperfect best. When we feel overwhelmed by all we cannot manage, self-forgiveness feels like a luxury we don't deserve. But I want to suggest that it's actually a necessity, the very foundation that allows us to move forward rather than remaining trapped in cycles of guilt and overcompensation. I've watched women transform their relationship with guilt by establishing a regular practice of self-forgiveness. Some write letters to themselves. Others speak aloud words of compassion while looking in the mirror. One friend creates small private rituals, lighting a candle, taking a mindful bath to symbolize the release of self-judgment. The form doesn't matter as much as the intention, to treat ourselves with the same kindness we would offer to someone we deeply love. Because here's what I've learned after decades of working to accept my own humanity. Forgiveness doesn't make us weaker or less responsible. It actually creates the emotional resilience we need to show up fully for our lives and for those who depend on us. When we're not exhausting ourselves with self-recrimination, we have more energy for creative solutions. When we're not hiding in shame about our limitations, we can ask for help more readily. When we're not brittle with perfectionism, we can bend without breaking when life demands flexibility. The paradox of self-forgiveness is that it doesn't lead to lowered standards. It leads to more authentic, sustainable ways of meeting our highest values, not from fear of inadequacy, but from love for what matters most. My sister, what awaits forgiveness in your heart today? What perceived failure or limitation have you been carrying like a stone in your pocket, taking it out to examine whenever you need evidence of your unworthiness. Perhaps it's time to plant that stone in your inner garden, to watch with wonder as what looked like failure becomes the foundation for new growth, new wisdom, new capacity for compassion, starting with compassion for yourself. Have you ever noticed how the world transforms after a heavy rain? How colors seem more vibrant, how the air feels washed clean, how even familiar landscapes appear somehow renewed? There's something similar that happens in our inner world when we finally allow ourselves to release the accumulated tension of trying to be everything for everyone. A clarity emerges, a spaciousness, a kind of beauty that wasn't possible when we were holding everything so tightly. I call this the sky after rain, that moment when the storms of overwhelm have passed, and we can see with fresh eyes what actually matters. For so many years, I mistook motion for meaning. I believed that my worth was measured by my productivity, by how many balls I could keep in the air simultaneously. I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor, proof that I was doing enough, giving enough, being enough. Perhaps you've done the same, but life has its ways of teaching us what our minds resist learning. For me, it was a health crisis that forced me to stop completely. No choice, no negotiation. The universe simply pressed pause on the life I'd been living at such an unsustainable pace. I remember lying in a hospital bed, watching through the window as rain fell steadily for 3 days. I had nothing to do but watch, no ability to check emails or manage household crises or meet anyone's needs but my own most basic ones. At first, the stillness was excruciating. My mind raced with all that wasn't getting done, all the ways I was falling behind, all the people who surely needed me. But as the days passed and the world somehow continued turning without my constant attention, something began to shift. I started to see the elaborate structures of pressure I had built around myself, many of them entirely of my own creation. When the rain finally stopped and the sun emerged, I found myself mesmerized by the sky, its vast blueness, its complete freedom from hurry or worry. And I wondered, when was the last time I had actually looked at the sky? When was the last time I had given myself permission to simply witness beauty without trying to earn it or achieve it or preserve it? That moment became a turning point. Not because I suddenly abandoned all responsibility, but because I began to understand the difference between carrying what truly matters and being crushed by what doesn't. The guilt of not being able to handle everything, it's a storm that many women weather throughout their lives. We believe the sun will never return if we put down even one of our many burdens. We fear that rest equals failure and that limitations equal unworthiness. But what if that guilt is actually the rain that precedes clarity? What if it's trying to wash away our illusions about what we can and should control, leaving behind a cleaner, truer understanding of our place in the world? After my time of enforced stillness, I returned to a life that looked outwardly similar, but felt inwardly transformed. I still had responsibilities, still had people who needed me, still had work that mattered deeply. But I had begun to understand that serving these values didn't require the sacrifice of my well-being. In fact, my ability to show up authentically for what matters most actually depended on my willingness to honor my own humanity. I began to recognize the early warning signs of overwhelm, the shortened breath, the tightened jaw, the racing thoughts. And instead of pushing through as I'd always done before, I began to see these signals as invitations to pause, to question, to discern what was needed rather than simply responding to every demand. Some days were still difficult, some seasons still brought more challenges than seemed manageable. But I had tasted the clarity that comes after surrender, and I couldn't go back to the old way of constant striving. The sky after rain isn't a destination we reach once and remain forever. It's a cyclical experience. Pressure builds, the storm breaks, clarity returns. But with each cycle, we can become more skilled at recognizing when we're creating unnecessary pressure, We can learn to welcome the cleansing rain of release sooner before the storm becomes too damaging. My sister, wherever you are in this cycle today, whether in the midst of overwhelming pressure, in the vulnerable space of letting go, or in the tentative enjoyment of newfound clarity, know that the sky remains above it all. Your worth is not determined by your productivity. Your value does not rise and fall with your ability to meet every expectation. Like the sky after rain, your essential nature remains constant, vast, open, inherently whole, regardless of the weather passing through you. Do you remember who you were before the world handed you its expectations? Before you became someone's mother, someone's partner, someone's employee or boss, before the roles and responsibilities accumulated like layers of paint over the original canvas of your being, I'm asking you to remember your name, not the name others call you when they need something, not the titles that define your usefulness, but your true name, the essence of who you are beneath all that doing. For so many women, this remembering feels nearly impossible. We've spent decades responding to what others need, adapting ourselves to fit the contours of their expectations, that we've almost forgotten there was an I that existed before all the shoulds. I lost track of my own name during the years when my children were small and my career was demanding every ounce of creativity I possessed. I became so focused on meeting external standards of success, being the mother who never missed a school event, the professional whose work was always impeccable, the friend who could be counted on in any crisis, that I stopped asking a fundamental question. What do I actually want? Not what do I think I should want, not what would make others happy, but what would make my own soul come alive. The day I began to reclaim my name was ordinary in every way except one. I was sitting at my desk, working through lunch again, when my gaze fell on a photograph from my college years. There I was, laughing, eyes bright with possibility, standing beside a half-finished sculpture in the art studio where I'd spent countless joyful hours. I barely recognized that woman, not because of the younger face or different hairstyle, but because of the unguarded joy, the sense of being fully present in her own life, not just managing everyone else's. What happened to her? I whispered to the empty room. Where did she go? She hadn't gone anywhere, of course. She had simply been buried beneath layers of other identities, other priorities, other people's needs. She had been waiting patiently for me to remember her name. That remembering didn't happen all at once. It began with small moments of reconnection, 5 minutes of writing in a journal before the house woke up, a detour to watch the sunset on my way home from work, saying no to a commitment that would have fulfilled someone else's expectation, but drained my already depleted energy. Gradually, these moments expanded. I rediscovered passions I'd set aside as impractical. I remembered opinions I'd been holding so quietly I'd almost forgotten they were mine. I recognized desires I'd been dismissing as selfish or unrealistic. I was reclaiming my name, letter by precious letter. This reclamation didn't make me less committed to those I love or less effective in my responsibilities. Quite the opposite. As I reconnected with my authentic self, I found I had more to give, not out of obligation or fear or guilt, but out of a wellspring of genuine presence. The guilt we feel when we can't manage everything often stems from this disconnection from our true selves. When we're operating purely from external expectations, being who we think we should be rather than who we actually are, every limitation feels like a personal failure rather than a natural boundary. But when we're grounded in our authentic identity, we can discern more clearly which responsibilities align with our deepest values and which are simply responses to others' projections or our own internalized shoulds. We can distinguish between the essential and the essence, merely urgent. Reclaiming your name doesn't happen in grand, dramatic gestures. It happens in quiet moments of choosing differently, of asking, is this truly mine to carry? of remembering that you are not just a set of functions to be performed, but a soul with its own unique purpose and rhythm. I've watched women transform when they begin this reclamation. A light returns to their eyes. Their movements become more deliberate, less frantic. They speak with a clarity that comes from knowing which battles are truly theirs to fight and which belong to someone else. They begin to understand that setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's honest. That saying no to what depletes them creates space to say yes to what nourishes them, and by extension, everyone they love. My sister, your name has been waiting for you to remember it. Not to erase the identities you've gathered through loving and living mother, partner, daughter, friend, professional, but to ensure that these roles are expressions of your authentic self rather than replacements for it. What might change in your relationship with guilt if you approached each day not as a list of expectations to fulfill, but as an opportunity to live in alignment with who you truly are? What might be possible if you remembered that no is a complete sentence, requiring no justification beyond your own inner knowing? Your name is still there, beneath all the layers, and it's whispering to you even now, inviting you back to yourself. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes when we stop trying to get it right all the time. When we release the exhausting grip of perfectionism and allow ourselves to be gloriously, beautifully human with all the messiness that entails. I call this dancing with imperfection. Not merely tolerating our limitations, but finding a kind of grace within them. Learning to move with rather than against the natural rhythm of our humanness. For most of my early life, I saw imperfection as something to overcome, to hide, to apologize for. Perhaps you've felt the same. Perhaps you too have spent countless hours trying to smooth away every wrinkle in your appearance, your home, your work, your relationships, as if the absence of visible flaws could somehow protect you from judgment or rejection. I remember preparing for important guests one evening, rushing around my home like a woman possessed. Every surface had to gleam, every pillow had to be perfectly placed, every dish had to be exquisitely presented. I was a hurricane of anxiety, snapping at anyone who disrupted my quest for the perfect evening. My daughter, watching this frenzy with wise eyes, finally asked, "Mom, are you trying to impress these people or connect with them? Because I don't think you can do both at the same time." Her question stopped me cold. In my determination to create a flawless experience, I had lost sight of why I was hosting these friends in the first place, not to dazzle them with my homemaking prowess, but to enjoy their company, to laugh together, to create memories. In that moment, I understood something essential. Perfectionism isn't actually about excellence. It's about fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear of being seen in our authentic humanity. Fear of the vulnerability that comes with saying, "This is who I am, imperfections and all." This fear is at the heart of the guilt we feel when we can't manage everything perfectly. We believe, somewhere deep in our bones, that our limitations make us less worthy of love, respect, or belonging. But what if the opposite is true? What if our imperfections are actually the doorway to genuine connection? Think about the people you feel most comfortable with, most deeply connected to. Are they the ones who present a polished, perfect image? Or are they the ones who show up authentically, who admit when they're struggling, who laugh at their own mistakes and make it safe for you to be human too? In my experience, it's our shared humanity, including our limitations, that creates the foundation for true intimacy. Our imperfections are not obstacles to meaningful connection. They're the very path that leads us there. I began to practice dancing with imperfection in small ways at first, sending an email with a typo and not following up with an apology, inviting friends over without spending hours cleaning first, admitting when I didn't know something instead of pretending expertise. Each act of imperfection felt terrifying initially, as if I were breaking some fundamental rule about womanhood. But each time, something surprising happened. The world didn't collapse. People didn't reject me. In fact, these moments of authentic humanity often created space for others to exhale, to relax their own grip on perfectionism. Gradually, I expanded this practice into more significant areas. I became more honest about my struggles as a parent, more willing to ask for help when I was overwhelmed, more able to say, "I made a mistake," without adding 1,000 justifications. The freedom in this surrender to authentic humanity is difficult to describe to someone still trapped in perfectionism's grip. It's like finally removing a corset you've worn so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. Suddenly, you can breathe all the way down to your belly. You can move without restriction. You can laugh without monitoring the sound. This doesn't mean abandoning standards or commitments. It doesn't mean we stop trying to do meaningful work or create beauty or serve others. It simply means we do these things from a place of authenticity rather than fear. We recognize that perfect was never the goal, wholehearted was. The dance with imperfection has its own distinctive rhythm. Some days we flow gracefully, embracing our humanity with ease. Other days we stumble, falling back into old patterns of self-criticism and impossible standards. But with practice, the dance becomes more natural, more joyful, and something miraculous happens when we persist in this practice. We begin to recognize beauty in the very places we once saw only flaws. The wrinkles that tell stories of laughter and worry, the scars that mark survival, the messy homes that evidence lives being genuinely lived rather than merely displayed. My sister, what might change if you allowed yourself to dance with your own imperfection today? If you welcomed your limitations not as enemies to be conquered, but as teachers guiding you toward a more authentic way of being? The guilt of not managing everything perfectly loses its power when we recognize that perfection was never the point. Connection was, love was, presence was, and none of these essential gifts require perfection. They require only our wholehearted humanity, beautiful, limited, and gloriously enough. There's a place I've been cultivating in my heart for many years now. A sanctuary I return to whenever I feel the familiar grip of not enough tightening around my throat. I call it the Garden of Enough. In this inner garden, there are no checklists, no comparisons, no voices telling me I should be more, do more, accomplish more. There is only the profound recognition that in this moment, exactly as I am sufficient, complete, whole. I didn't always have access to this garden. For most of my life, I lived in the barren landscape of never enough, a place where achievement simply raised the bar higher, where rest felt like failure, where my worth was tied to my usefulness to others. Perhaps you know this landscape too. Perhaps you've spent years trying to prove your value through constant doing, constant giving, constant striving, only to find that the horizon of enough keeps receding before you, always just out of reach. I remember the day I first glimpsed another possibility. I was sitting with my infant grandson, watching him sleep in my arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in perfect trust, his being complete without any doing at all. Looking at him, I knew with absolute certainty that his value had nothing to do with what he could produce or achieve. He was infinitely precious simply because he existed. No accomplishment could increase his worth. No failure could diminish it. And in that moment of clarity, a voice within me whispered, "What if the same is true for you?" It was a revolutionary thought that perhaps my worth, like his, was inherent rather than earned. That maybe, just maybe, I had been enough all along. This revelation didn't immediately transform my relationship with guilt and perfectionism. The habits of never enough were too deeply ingrained, the voices of self-criticism too familiar. But it planted a seed, the first tender shoot in what would become my garden of enough. I began to cultivate this garden deliberately, learning from teachers both expected and surprising. From young children who knew instinctively how to be fully present without worrying about productivity, from elders who had discovered the liberation of being rather than merely doing, from my own body, which showed me through illness and fatigue the non-negotiable reality of human limitation. Slowly, I learned to recognize the difference between genuine responsibilities and compulsive overcommitment, between authentic service and self-depleting people-pleasing, between meaningful standards and crippling perfectionism. The garden of enough isn't about lowering our standards or abandoning our commitments. It's about reconnecting with the truth of our inherent worthiness, a worthiness that exists independent of external validation or achievement. When we know, in our bones, that we are already enough, we can engage with our responsibilities from a place of choice rather than desperate proving. We can discern which yeses truly align with our deepest values and which stem from fear of disapproval or rejection. We can set boundaries not as acts of selfishness, but as expressions of self-respect. The guilt of not being able to do everything loses its power in the garden of enough, not because we suddenly become capable of superhuman feats, but because we no longer measure our worth by the impossible standard of doing it all. I've watched women transform when they discover this garden within themselves. Their movements become more deliberate, their choices more authentic, their presence more complete. They stop apologizing for taking up space or having needs. They recognize rest not as a luxury, but as an essential part of sustainable living. They discover, often with astonishment, that their relationships actually improve when they stop trying to be perfect in them, that their work becomes more meaningful when it's no longer driven by the fear of inadequacy, that their children thrive not when they're parented flawlessly, but when they're loved unconditionally, including witnessing how their mothers practice self-compassion. The path to this garden is not linear. We find our way there and then lose it again. We taste the freedom of enough and then fall back into the old habits of striving and self-criticism. But with practice, we can return more quickly, recognize the symptoms of never enough sooner, and choose differently before exhaustion forces the choice upon us. My sister, the garden of enough already exists within you. It's not something you need to create from scratch, but rather something to uncover a truth your soul has always known. Beneath the layers of conditioning and expectation, you are not valuable because of what you accomplish. You are valuable because of who you are, a miraculous constellation of gifts, perspectives, loves, and wisdom that has never existed before and will never exist again in quite the same way. The world doesn't need your exhaustion or your self-depletion. It needs your authentic presence, your genuine yes, and your honest no. Your willingness to live from your center rather than from the expectations on your periphery. In the garden of enough, guilt loosens its grip, not because our circumstances necessarily change, but because our relationship to them does. We stop trying to be superhuman and embrace the beautiful limitations and capacities of being fully human. And in that embrace, we find not resignation, but liberation. Not lowered standards, but more sustainable ones. Not less impact, but more authentic and meaningful contribution. You have always been enough. You are enough now. You will always be enough. Welcome to the garden, my sister. The gate has been open all along. There's a stillness that comes when we finally put down the heavy weights we've been carrying, the weight of perfection, the weight of others' expectations, the weight of our own relentless self-judgment. In that stillness, we can hear the truth we've known all along, that our worth isn't measured in tasks completed or expectations met, but in the love we've given and received, the authentic presence we've brought to our precious days. The guilt of not being able to handle everything, it was never meant to be your constant companion. It was only ever a messenger, trying to guide you back to your own humanity, to the beautiful truth that you were never meant to do it all. You were only meant to do your part, with as much love and presence as you can bring in each imperfect moment. And when you forget this truth, as we all do sometimes, I hope you'll remember that forgiving yourself isn't just an act of personal healing. It's a revolution, a quiet, powerful declaration that women deserve to live from a place of wholeness rather than constant proving. So tonight, as you lay your head down, feeling the weight of what remains undone, I want you to place your hand over your heart and feel its steady rhythm. That heartbeat has carried you through every triumph and failure, every joy and heartbreak, every moment of strength, and every moment of surrender. It bears witness to your inherent worthiness, a worthiness that has never depended on what you accomplish. You are not the sum of what you do. You are the love you carry, the wisdom you embody, the presence you bring to each moment, even and especially the imperfect ones. And that, my dear sister, has always been more than enough.